All right, welcome back, everyone. We'll pick up Mr. Jacobson if you wish to resume with further questions, sir.
Good afternoon, Dr. Chen.
Good afternoon, sir.
Before the break, we began very briefly talking about the analysis you did of the individual plaintiffs in this case. Can you briefly describe at a high level the analysis that you did?
For the individual plaintiffs in this case, I received the residential addresses of each plaintiff. I geocoded those addresses so that I would know where they lived geographically. And then I overlaid those addresses onto all of the enacted plans, as well as the computer simulated districting plans, their individual districts. So I identified every plaintiff's, well, each plaintiff that I analyzed, I identified the plaintiff's enacted district, as well as the computer simulated district. And then I compared the enacted to the computer simulated districts in terms of the partisanship of those districts in order to identify outliers, partisan outliers.
If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 238, which is it's actually figure 54 of Dr. Chen's rebuttal report.
And if you could just give me a moment to grab the other binder.
Sure.
Okay.
Dr. Chen, what are the names going on the vertical axis?
Just looking at that vertical axis along the left, these are the names of the individual plaintiffs that I analyzed.
And to clarify, does this include all 37 individual plaintiffs in this case?
It's just the plaintiffs living in districts, in groupings that I had previously in my report produced county grouping level analysis.
And this is for the House County groupings?
Yes.
So these are just the plaintiffs who live in House County groupings for which you did the individual grouping level analysis that we saw. I'm sorry.
So
these are just the plaintiffs who live in the House County groupings for which you did the individual grouping level analysis that we saw right before the break. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
What's on the horizontal axis going from left to right?
On the horizontal axis, that axis is measuring the partisanship of these various districts using their Democratic vote share as measured once again by the same 2010 to 2016 statewide election measure composite that we've been talking about earlier today.
So let's pick a particular plaintiff to use as an example here. Let's look at plaintiff Rebecca Johnson, who's on the, I don't know, 8th or so row. First, what does the red star there represent?
So in this 8th row for plaintiff Rebecca Johnson, the red star indicates plaintiff Johnson's enacted House district. In other words, the district, the enacted House district in which plaintiff Rebecca Johnson resides. So it's HD 74, and that's why you see a star there with HD 74 written right above it. And the placement there along this horizontal axis tells us the partisanship, the Democratic vote share of that district of HD 74. And so if you look down to the bottom of this figure, to the horizontal axis along this figure, you can see that HD 74, that red star, it's placed right around 40% or 0.4, telling us that is the partisanship, the Democratic vote share of plaintiff Rebecca Johnson's district.
And staying on Ms. Johnson, the same row, what do the gray circles to the right of that red star represent? Or I guess across the entire row.
There we're going to see 1,000 gray circles. And those gray circles represent plaintiff Rebecca Johnson's district in which she would have lived under the 1,000 computer simulated maps in House Simulation Set 1. So that's why we have 1,000 gray circles. And so each one of those gray circles is one gray circle from each one of the 1,000 House simulated plans. And as before, I'm plotting those gray circles along the horizontal axis in terms of the Democratic vote share of those simulated districts in which plaintiff Rebecca Johnson would have been living.
So that's the partisanship of the district using your 2010 to 2016 measure, is that right?
Exactly.
The partisanship of the district that Ms. Johnson would live in each of your 1,000 simulations?
Exactly.
And so what does the data show for Ms. Johnson here on this row when you compare the enacted plan to the district she would live in under the simulated plans?
What we see here on this row is that 99% of the simulated districts in which Ms. Johnson would have been residing are actually to the right rather than to the left of the red star. In other words, under the simulated plans, under 990 of the simulated plans, Ms. Johnson would have been placed into a more heavily Democratic district. And only in 1% of the plans would Ms. Johnson have been placed into a less Democratic leaning district.
And those two numbers you just gave, where are you getting those numbers from on this chart here?
We can see those two numbers reported in the right column of this figure. So scroll over on Ms. Rebecca Johnson's row all the way to the right column of this figure. And you'll see in parentheses in a 1% and a 99%. And all I'm reporting there is first the percentage of the simulated districts to the left of the red star, and then the percent of the simulated districts to the right of the red star.
Let's do one more example. How about plaintiff Joshua Perry Brown, who I think we're going to hear from probably likely tomorrow in this case. What do you find for plaintiff Brown on this chart?
So we'll see plaintiff Joshua Perry Brown 2 rows down from where Rebecca Johnson was. So that's the 10th row here. And again, we're going to see a red star for plaintiff Brown's district, as well as 1,000 gray circles indicating the computer simulated districts in which plaintiff Brown would have been residing. So let's start with the red star. You see the red star on that row, it's HD 60. And HD 60 with that red star is placed right around, it appears to be about 0.66 Democratic vote share. So this is a district that's about 66% Democratic vote share. All right, so that's the red star, the enacted district that plaintiff Josh Brown lives within. Now let's look at the 1,000 gray circles on that row. And you can see that those 1,000 gray circles are all in this blob, right around about 61 to maybe about 63%. They're all in the same little blob to the left of that red star. What that tells us is that those 1,000 gray circles, those 1,000 simulated districts in which plaintiff Joshua Brown would have been residing under the 1,000 simulated House plans, they are all less Democratic packed than the actual district in the enacted plan that plaintiff Josh Brown lives within. So you can see that all 1,000 of them are to the left of the red star. That's why in the right column, the far right column, you see a 100% and a 0%, indicating that all 1,000 gray circles are to the left of the red star.
Dr. Chen, without going through the details of each one, using the numbers in the parentheses on the right side of this chart, can you list off the individual plaintiffs who live in districts that are extreme outliers compared to the districts they would live in under your House simulation set 1?
Yes, so I'm going to list them out. Vinod Thomas, Paula Ann Chapman, Kristen Parker, Julie Ann Frey, Jackson Thomas Dunn Jr., Rebecca Johnson, Lily Nicole Quick, Joshua Perry Brown, Dwight Jordan, David Dwight Brown, Electa E. Person, Donald Allen Rumpf, Amy Claire Oseroff, Leslie Brooke Wishman, Derek Miller, Carlton E. Campbell Sr., Rosalind Sloan, Mark S. Peters, Joseph Thomas Gates, Stephen Douglas McGrigor, and Rebecca Harper.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 239.
Okay.
And does this show, Dr. Chen, the same thing except for House Simulation Set 2 instead of House Simulation Set 1?
Exactly.
And do you find any different results here for plaintiff Leon Schaller than what we saw in the prior one?
Yes, we do. So we can go down to Leon Schaller, which is about roughly 15 rows down. And when we zoom in on that row, what we can see here is that plaintiff Schaller resided under the enacted plan in HD 64, and in this figure for house simulation set 2, we can see that that district is a partisan outlier compared to the 1,000 computer simulated districts that Leon Schaller would have resided in under the simulated plans. So clearly it was a partisan outlier under set 2.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 117, which is figure 97 from Dr. Chen's original report.
And I'm going to get the other binder out.
Sorry about that. What does this exhibit show?
This is a similar figure, except this time I'm analyzing Senate simulation set 1 plans.
So this is the Senate instead of the House?
Exactly.
And does this figure show all 37 individual plaintiffs in this case?
It doesn't show all the plaintiffs. It only shows the plaintiffs residing in the Senate county groupings that I had already presented county grouping level analysis for earlier in the report.
Without going into all the details, again, using the numbers and the parentheses on the right side, which individual plaintiffs do you find live in Senate districts that are extreme outliers compared to the district they would live in under your simulations?
I'm going to list them out. Vinod Thomas, Paula Ann Chapman, Pamela Morton, Kristen Parker, Jackson Thomas Dunn Jr., Rebecca Johnson, Dwight Jordan, David Dwight Brown, Karen Sue Holbrook, James Mackin Nesbitt, George David Gauck, Derek Miller, Mark S. Peters, Joseph Thomas Gates, William Service, Stephen Douglas McGrigor, Rebecca Harper, Nancy Bradley, and Aaron Wolf.
How about plaintiff Kathleen Barnes about, 8 rows from the bottom?
I was just listing out the outliers that were outliers at the 95% level. We can see for Kathleen Barnes' row, when we zoom in on that one, that Kathleen Barnes' district, SD 48, is an outlier. It's more extreme, it's more Republican leaning than 91.4% of the corresponding simulated districts. So not quite to 95%, but still an outlier.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 118, just figure 98 from Dr. Chen's report. Dr. Chen, what does this figure show?
It's a very similar analysis, except this time it's for simulation set 2 of the Senate plans rather than set 1.
And are your results essentially the same as what you found for set 1 in the Senate?
Yes, they are.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Dr. Chen, you mentioned at the outset of your testimony that one of the sources of information you relied upon to reach your conclusions in this case was analysis of Dr. Hoffler's files that were produced by his daughter in this case. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did you analyze draft House and Senate maps that Dr. Hoffler last modified in June 2017?
I did.
What type of analysis did you do of these June 2017 draft maps?
I compared these draft maps district by district. I compared these draft maps to the final General Assembly enacted plans in August of 2017.
And why did you conduct this analysis?
So I wanted to know whether or not I could measure or discern the similarity between the draft maps and the final maps. And the broader reason why I wanted to do this analysis is that I wanted to respond, or I wanted to assess the veracity of claims made by various experts, defendants' experts, regarding their claims that Dr. Hoffler either was constrained by the adopted criteria or was following the adopted criteria in his drafting of the House and Senate maps. And so in order to evaluate the veracity of those claims, I wanted to determine whether or not Dr. Hoffler had been following or was constrained by the adopted criteria. and I wanted to evaluate whether Dr. Hoffler had already largely drafted, the districts in the House and Senate plan prior to the adopted criteria's passage.
Can you remind us, when did the joint redistricting committees pass the adopted criteria?
The joint redistricting committees adopted the adopted criteria, or passed the adopted criteria, on August the 10th, 2017.
And I believe you analyzed one draft House map from Dr. Hoffler and one draft Senate map from Dr. Hoffler. What were the dates of when those files were last modified?
The last modified dates of those Maptitude backup files, folders, was June the 24th and June the 28th of 2017. In other words, about 6 weeks prior to the passage of the adopted criteria.
What methodology did you employ to determine how much of the enacted plans were already completed by those June draft maps?
I compared the June draft map to the final General Assembly map, district by district, and here's how I specifically did that. For every single district in one of Dr. Hoffler's draft maps, and I did this for the House and the Senate draft maps, for every one of Dr. Hoffler's draft district, I identified the corresponding district in the General Assembly's final August 2017 plan. So I identified the corresponding district as the district under the final August 2017 map that most closely overlapped with Dr. Hoffler's draft district. And I did that district by district. So I first identified the corresponding most overlapping district in terms of population. Now, having identified that corresponding district, I then made a plan-wide comparison. So specifically, what I calculated up was for every one of Dr. Hoffler's draft districts, what percentage of the population of that district and what percentage of the census blocks of that district were also going to be assigned to the corresponding final district in the General Assembly's 2017 final map. In other words, what was the population overlap between Dr. Hoffler's draft version of the district and the corresponding final version of that district that the General Assembly passed in August 2017. So I did those calculations district by district. And then I calculated up for the entire draft map of Dr. Hoffler's, for the entire draft map, what the total percentage of North Carolina's population was, as well as North Carolina's census blocks. What the total population was that had already been assigned by Dr. Hoffler into what would become their final draft districts. In other words, what percentage of North Carolina's population is assigned to the same district under Dr. Hoffler's draft map as they were assigned to their corresponding final districts under the General Assembly's final map.
And Dr. Chen, we'll get to some examples of this in a moment to hopefully make that more concrete. But statewide, and let's start with the Senate, and I'll point you to page 2 of your rebuttal report. Statewide.
And if you could just give me a moment to grab it out.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. 123. Let's start with the Senate. Statewide, what were your findings in terms of this overlap analysis? And as you go through it, I think you have a typographical glitch that you want to correct.
Right. So I'll describe my findings first, and then I'll tell you about the typo. So for the state Senate plan, I analyzed a June 24th, 2017 draft Senate map. And what I mean by that is this was a Maptitude backup that had a last modified date of June the 24th, 2017. And for this draft Senate map, I found that Dr. Hoffler had already finished assigning 97.6% of North Carolina's census blocks, which contain 95.6% of the state's population, into their final corresponding districts. So that's what I found with respect to the Senate map. Now, as you mentioned a moment ago, I made a typographical mistake, and that appears at the bottom of page 2. And that's the third and fourth lines from the bottom in page 2, where I just flipped around those two numbers, 95.6% and 97.6%. I just flipped them around.
So it's the same numbers, you just listed the wrong one for census blocks that was supposed to be for population and vice versa.
Exactly.
What did you find with respect to the,
I'm sorry, so which is correct? Could you just read the sentence correctly
Yes.
so that we have exactly what is the correct version?
Yes, Your Honor, I'll do that. So I'm gonna repeat what I just said, and these are going to be the correct numbers. In a June 24th, 2017 draft Senate map, Dr. Hoffler had already finished assigning 97.6% of North Carolina's census blocks, containing 95.6% of the state's population, into their final districts.
Thank you, sir.
and how about the House? What did you find for your statewide numbers for the House plan, the June draft House plan?
And this was the June 28th, 2017 draft House map. And I found, for this draft House map of Dr. Hoffler's, I found that Dr. Hoffler had already finished assigning 90.9% of North Carolina's census blocks, containing 88.2% of the state's population, into their final districts.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Let's start with the Senate map now, the June draft Senate map that you just described. If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 572. I believe should be at the very back of the binders we gave you. Dr. Chen, what was the name of this Maptitude draft map?
This particular Maptitude, the draft, or Maptitude plan, was given a name, and this was a name that Dr. Hoffler would have had to type in, and the name was NC Senate J24.
And what, I should say, what are we looking at right now on the screen? What is in Exhibit 572?
This exhibit is a screenshot of what's called the plan settings in the Maptitude in the Maptitude plan. So the plan settings are just things that the user can change. And so it describes some various properties in one of these tabs. And that properties tab is what we're looking at on this exhibit right here. So this is the plan settings properties tab.
And what does it indicate in the field titled Administrator? What is indicated there?
Well, the administrator field is something that the Maptitude user has to type in. It's not automatically generated. And here, the Maptitude user typed in TBH, presumably standing for Dr. Thomas Hoffler.
And I think you said this before, but just 2 rows underneath that, what's the last modified date of this file?
The last modified date of this file, which is the date at which it was closed and thus a backup was triggered, was created, was June the 24th, 2017 at 9:32 a.m. in the morning.
And if you look beneath that, it says comments, and there's like 4 or 5 rows there. What is that? What do those represent?
These are comments that appear to have been automatically generated by the Maptitude software. And essentially what these comments are going to give us is a history of the lineage from which this current plan was derived. So the current plan was copied from another plan, and that's why we're going to see 4 lines that start with copied from. And in fact, for the last line, we even know when it appeared to have been copied. This last line, the 4th line, it reads copied from NC Senate J23. And we know that it was copied from this other plan called NC Senate J23. And that was done on June the 24th, 2017. And we know this because of the date created field. So that tells us the date at which this plan was created by copying it from a previous plan, a previous draft plan called NC Senate J23. And so we're just going in this in reverse chronological order, tracing the lineage. So that was the 4th line in the comments row. Now look at the line above that, the 3rd line. It reads copied from NC Senate June-1. That's that 3rd row in the comments window. That was, in turn, the previous plan that the NC Senate J23 plan had been copied from. So now we're going 2 steps back in the lineage of this plan. And then go one row above that, and we see yet another row copied from 2016 Senate minimal changes. That was yet another maptitude another maptitude plan that the previous one was copied from. And then finally, at the very top row, we see the words copied from final NC Senate adopted. So ultimately, the lineage traces back to this first plan called final NC Senate adopted, which presumably refers to the 2011 enacted Senate plan.
Okay, let's now look through some of the individual Senate county groupings and the overlap analysis you did. If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 142, which is figure 19 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. Dr. Chen, what Senate county grouping does this show?
This exhibit is analyzing the Cumberland-Hoke county grouping in the Senate plan.
And to orient us on this exhibit, what does the map in the very bottom left represent?
The map on the bottom left is Dr. Hoffler's draft version of this county grouping, the 2 districts that he had drawn in that June the 24th draft Senate map that we were talking about earlier. So this is Dr. Hoffler's draft version of this county grouping from June the 24th.
And what about the map on the right, the bottom right? What does that map represent?
The map on the right is the final General Assembly passed version of this county grouping. And I took that from the Senate Bill 691 plan that was passed in August 2017. So that's the final General Assembly version from August 2017.
Looking now at the numbers on the top half of this chart, what do the numbers on the horizontal axis represent? Just the labels, 19 and 21?
So in the horizontal axis of this figure, those numbers 19 and 21 refer to the district numbers in the General Assembly's Senate Bill 691 plan. In other words, the district numbers from the plan that the General Assembly passed in August 2017.
And what about the numbers going vertically, 19 and 21?
Vertically, we see those numbers 19 and 21, and those numbers refer to the district numbers from Dr. Hoffler's draft Senate map. This draft Senate map that had the last modified date of June the 24th, 2017.
We'll do this a couple of different ways because it's confusing, but what does the number 99.42% represent in that bottom left corner?
So the number 99.42% tells us the percentage of the population in Dr. Hoffler's version of District 19 that was also assigned to District 19 in the final Senate Bill 691 map.
And how about the 100% in the top right?
That one looks at District 21. So specifically, that 100% there in the top right tells us that 100% of the population from Dr. Hoffler's draft District 21 in that June 24th map was also assigned to District 21 in the General Assembly's final Senate Bill 691 plan from August 2017.
So if we could try to tie this together using those numbers and now connecting them to the maps at the bottom, are you saying, Dr. Chen, that if we look at all the people who are assigned to District 21 in the bottom left map, 100% of those people were also assigned to District 21 in the bottom right map?
Exactly. You look at all the areas that were in District 21 in Dr. Hoffler's version of 21, which is on the left side. And all of those areas, all of those people, were also assigned to District 21 in the right map, the Senate Bill 691 final map.
And 99.42% of the people assigned to District 19 in the map on the left were also assigned to District 19 in the map on the right?
Exactly. And so it's almost 100%. And that's just because a very tiny portion of what used to be District 19 under Dr. Hoffler's version of District 19 were shifted into District 21 by the final Senate Bill 691 plan. But the vast majority, 99.42% of the people in Dr. Hoffler's version of District 19 were also assigned to District 19 in the final General Assembly's Senate Bill 691 plan.
And Dr. Chen, is what we have on the screen here, the little green portion that goes over the E and the R in Cumberland on the map on the bottom right, those are the people who were assigned to District 19 on the map on the left, but not District 19 on the map on the right, the 0.58%, is that right?
Exactly. Right there, that little green area, that's that very small percentage, that very small number of people that were shifted from District 19 to 21.
Dr. Chen, we've heard a lot of talk that maybe the whole I'm sorry, before I get to that, and then just to clarify, this county grouping was one that was entirely redrawn by the special master in Covington, is that right?
Yes.
But which version of the plan did you use for purposes of this overlap analysis?
Not the special master version. I looked at the Senate Bill 691 plan that the General Assembly passed in August 2017.
Dr. Chen, we've heard a lot of talk that maybe the high degree of overlap we see was as a result of the whole county rule and sort of dictating the contours of districts. Did the whole county rule dictate which parts of Cumberland County had to be attached to District 21?
No, it didn't.
Did the whole county rule dictate that sort of dragon-shaped part of Cumberland County there had to be attached to District 21?
No, it didn't.
If we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 143, which is Figure 20 from Dr. Chen's report. What Senate county grouping does this analyze?
This exhibit analyzes the Davie-Forsyth County grouping in the Senate plan.
And again, this is the last time we'll do this. What's the map on the left and the map on the right?
Again, the map on the left is Dr. Hoffler's version of the districts in this county grouping in his June the 24th draft Senate map. And on the right, what we see is the General Assembly's final Senate Bill 691 version of this county grouping.
And what do you find in terms of the level of overlap between the two?
Well, we generally find here in this figure, that the level of overlap between these two versions of the county grouping are extremely high. We can see that everybody that was assigned to Dr. Hoffler's District 31 was also assigned to District 31 in the final General Assembly map in Senate Bill 691, 100%. For District 32, we can see that 97.94% of the people that were assigned to District 32 in Dr. Hoffler's map were also assigned to District 32 in the final General Assembly's Senate Bill 691 plan.
Did the whole county rule dictate which parts of Forsyth County had to be put in District 31 versus 32?
No, not at all.
Is there something in the whole county rule that says you have to draw this sort of horseshoe-shaped ring around District 32?
No.
If we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 144, which is Figure 21 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report, what Senate county grouping does this analyze?
This figure analyzes the Duplin, Harnett, Johnston, Lee, Nash, and Sampson county grouping in the Senate.
And what did you find in terms of overlap for this county grouping?
Well, there are 3 districts in their county grouping. They're called 10, 11, and 12. And we see a very high degree of overlap between each of these 3 districts and in Dr. Hoffler's draft Senate map and the final corresponding districts in the Senate Bill 691 plan. For each of these 3 districts, we can say that over 90% of the population in the Dr. Hoffler version of the district was also assigned to the same number district in the final Senate Bill 691 plan version of that same district.
So, and did the whole county rule dictate which parts of Johnston County to split up between these 3 districts?
No, it did not.
If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 145, which is Figure 22 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. What county grouping does this show?
This exhibit analyzes the Durham, Granville, and Person county grouping in the Senate.
And what did you find?
Well, there are 2 districts in this grouping. They're named Districts 20 and 22. And it appears in this figure on the top that they are perfectly identical in the Dr. Hoffler version of these districts as they are to the final Senate Bill 691 plan version of these districts. In other words, these two maps are completely identical in terms of how districts 20 and 22 split up Durham County and this entire county group.
And did the whole county rule dictate which parts of Durham County to put in districts 20 versus 21? Exactly which parts?
It did not.
So this county grouping was already fully done by June, is it June 28th, I believe?
It's
2017?
June the 24th.
June 24th, I apologize. Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 146. Figure 23 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. What county grouping does this depict?
This exhibit depicts the Franklin-Wake County grouping in the Senate plan.
And what do you find in terms of overlap for this county grouping?
Well, there are 5 districts in this county grouping, 5 Senate districts, and 2 of them are very similar from the Dr. Hoffler version of those 2 districts to the final Senate Bill 691 plan version of these districts. And you can see that in the rows titled 16 and 17. So District 16 and District 17 both exhibit over a 90% overlap with the same numbered district in the final Senate Bill 691 plan. And in addition, we see a third district, District 18, that's also quite similar. It exhibits 89.16% overlap with the final version of District 18 in the final Senate Bill 691 plan.
Dr. Chen, if we recall back to our earlier partisanship analysis of this Wake County Senate grouping, Wake Franklin, that is, was there anything different about Districts 17 and 18 from the other 3?
Well, sure. I mean, in general, we saw from my earlier figures that Districts 17 and 18 are the relatively more Republican-leaning of the districts in this county grouping.
So Dr. Hoffler had already nearly completed drawing those 2 Senate districts by June 24th.
That's exactly right.
Do you, if we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 147, which is figure 24 from Dr. Chen's report. What county grouping is this?
This exhibit shows the Mecklenburg County grouping in the Senate plan.
And what results do you find for overlap?
Well, there are 5 districts, 5 Senate districts in this grouping, and we see that 2 of them exhibit a very high overlap. So let's start with District 41 at the very top of this figure, in the top right of the figure. We see here that all 100% of the people that were assigned to Dr. Hoffler's version of District 41 were also assigned to the Senate Bill 691 plan version of District 41. So it exhibits basically a perfect overlap. We also see a very high degree of overlap with District. We also see a very high degree of overlap for District 39. We see that 94.06% of the population that was assigned to Dr. Hoffler's version of District 39 were also assigned to the final General Assembly's Senate Bill 691 planned version of District 39. So we see 2 districts here with very high overlap from Dr. Hoffler's draft map to the final General Assembly plan.
And recalling back to your earlier partisanship analysis of this Senate county grouping, was there anything different about Districts 39 and 41 in terms of their partisanship from the other 3 districts?
Sure, Districts 39 and 41 are the relatively more Republican-leaning of the districts in this grouping.
So Dr. Hoffler had already either fully completed or almost fully completed the 2 Republican-leaning districts in this Senate county grouping?
Yes.
By June 24th?
By June 24th, yes.
And did the whole county rule dictate the contours at all of any district in this grouping, including 39 and 41?
No, not at all. The whole county rule has nothing to do with the district boundaries that are purely within Mecklenburg County. That's just not how the whole county rule works.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 140, which is figure 17 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. What county grouping does this depict?
This exhibit depicts the Alamance, Guilford, and Randolph County grouping in the Senate.
And as we discussed earlier with the Hope-Cumberland County grouping, this grouping was partially redrawn from by the special master in Covington. But for purposes of this overlap analysis, which version of it did you use?
I compared Dr. Hoffler's version of this grouping to the Senate Bill 691 plan version of this grouping, the one that the General Assembly drew in August 2017.
And what did you find in terms of overlap in this grouping?
Well, I found that all 4 of the districts in this grouping exhibit a high degree of overlap with their corresponding final districts in the Senate Bill 691 plan. In other words, Dr. Hoffler's version of these 4 districts was very similar or identical to the final version of these districts in Senate Bill 691.
And did the whole county rule dictate which parts of Guilford County had to be divided up between these 4 districts?
No, it did not.
The last one in the Senate, Dr. Chen, pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 141, just figure 18 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. I'm going to make you say the names of all these counties. Which county grouping is this?
This exhibit shows us the Allegheny, Ashe, Caswell, Rockingham, Stokes, Surrey, Watauga, and Wilkes County grouping in the Senate.
Dr. Chen, in this one instance, did the whole county rule in fact play a major role in shaping the contours of these districts?
It did.
We just looked through a set of Senate county groupings. Is that the full set of all Senate county groupings that were redrawn in 2017 that have more than one district, meaning it's not just dictated entirely by the whole county rule?
Yes.
What overall conclusions do you draw based on this analysis of Dr. Hoffler's June 24th draft Senate map with respect to whether the adopted criteria constrained Dr. Hoffler in drawing the Senate plan and the extent to which he was following the adopted criteria in drawing the Senate plan?
Well, I just explained how I concluded that all of these county groupings had some or all districts with a very high degree of overlap between Dr. Hoffler's version of these individual districts and the August 2017 final Senate Bill 691 plan version of these districts. And so based on that finding, I'm able to conclude that Dr. Hoffler clearly could not have been following the adopted criteria if he had finished or largely finished drafting many of these districts about 6 weeks in June 24th of 2017, about 6 weeks prior to the redistricting committee's passage of the adopted criteria. Logically, Dr. Hoffler could not have been following the adopted criteria.
I'd like to now turn to the June House plan. Let's pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 569. What was the name of this June draft House map that you analyzed?
If you could just repeat your question.
What was the name, the file name or the plan name of this June draft House map that you analyzed?
The user appeared to name this plan as NC House J-25.
And when was this file last modified?
It was last modified, it has a last modified date of June the 28th, 2017 at 12:04 p.m.
And without going through them each one by one again, what do the rows in the comments box represent?
It just tells us the lineage of where this plan came from in terms of the previous draft plans or the previous plans, maptitude plans, that this plan had been copied from or derived from. And so you see at the very bottom, it was immediately derived from another plan called NC House J10. You see 7 total rows, I won't go through them all, but that tells us the entire lineage of these of where this plan came from. And you see at the very top, all of this originally came from a plan called, quote, Final NC House Adopted, presumably referring to the 2011 House plan, the adopted 2011 plan.
Objection, Your Honor. I don't have the news what it's presumably referring
So, overruled, allow him to qualify by saying presumably.
let's pull up plaintiff's exhibit
Let
1.
let me just note, we do not have in our notebooks 569. So just,
We'll get you
that's
that and
fine.
the other ones.
We've got it on the screen, so we could just, later on, we can get back.
There might be 2 others that fall into that category, but we'll put them on the screen.
Okay, that's fine.
I apologize. Can we pull up plaintiff's exhibit 124, which is figure 1 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report? Dr. Chen, what house-county grouping does this analyze?
This exhibit analyzes the Mecklenburg County grouping in the House plan.
And like with the Senate, what do the 2 maps at the bottom of this exhibit depict?
The map on the left depicts the Mecklenburg portion of Dr. Hoffler's June 28th draft House plan. So that's the map on the left. Now, on the right, we see the final General Assembly House Bill 927 version of the Mecklenburg County grouping, the version that was passed in August 2017. And we can see that there are 12 districts in each one of these.
And what do the numbers, the 12 numbers in this chart reveal? What do you find?
So what we see here is that there are 12 districts, and the 12 districts in Dr. Hoffler's, from Dr. Hoffler's draft plan in June of 28th, all exhibit either a perfect overlap or a near perfect overlap with their final corresponding districts in the final House Bill 927 plan. And you see this in the figure that all of these districts are either right at 100% population overlap or at least over 90% population overlap with their corresponding final districts in the House Bill 927 plan. You can see that district number 88 was basically renamed as 92, and 92 was renamed as 88 from Dr. Hoffler's version to the final House Bill 927 plan. But those 2 districts exhibit a very high degree, 100% and 96% overlap with their corresponding final districts. So every single district, every single one of these 12 districts exhibits either a perfect overlap or a near perfect overlap between Dr. Hoffler's version of the district to the final House Bill 927 plan version of the
So
district.
Dr. Chen, so these 12 districts were essentially already either fully complete or nearly fully complete by June 28th?
Exactly.
Did the whole county rule play any role whatsoever in how to draw these 12 districts all within Mecklenburg County?
No, the lines are all within Mecklenburg County. That's just not how the whole county rule works.
Pull up plaintiff's exhibit 126, which is figure 3 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. What county grouping does this analyze?
This exhibit analyzes the Bladen, Greene, Harnett, Johnston, Lee, Sampson, and Wayne County grouping in the House.
And without going through all of them, or maybe just go through the ones that you want to go through, what do you find in your overlap analysis?
Well, we see here that 5 of the districts, actually 4 of the districts, exhibit at least a 95% overlap between Dr. Hoffler's version of the district and the final House Bill 927 plan version of the district. A 5th district, district number 10, exhibits almost a 95% overlap, 94.82%, and that's what you see in the bottom left corner of the top figure. So that's 5 districts with a very high degree of overlap.
And Dr. Chen, just looking at the maps on the bottom, did the whole county rule dictate how to draw those odd shapes that we see in districts 10, 21, and 22? Districts 10 and 21, I should say, specifically.
Within Wayne and Sampson, no, it did not.
And did the whole county rule dictate which exact parts of Harnett County to put into HD 51?
Did not.
And so Dr. Hoffler had already completed or substantially completed drawing these 5 districts by June 28th?
Exactly.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 127. This is rebuttal report figure 4. Which county grouping does this analyze?
This exhibit analyzes the Caswell and Orange County grouping in the House plan.
And briefly, what do you find?
We see here that both of the districts in this county grouping exhibit a very high degree of overlap between Dr. Hoffler's version of the districts, of these 2 districts, and the final House Bill 927 plan version of these districts. The overlap for one of the districts, District 50, is 100%, and for the other district, 56, it's 96.89%.
So Dr. Hoffler had already essentially completed drawing these two districts by June 28th.
Had almost completed, yes.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 128, which is Figure 5 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. Which county grouping is this?
This exhibit displays the Chatham-Durham county grouping in the House.
And what did you find?
Well, we see here that there's one district that's a perfect match or a perfect overlap between Dr. Hoffler's plan and the House Bill 927 plan, and that's District 54.
And how about 30 and 31?
Well, we see that districts 30 and 31 exhibit a high degree of overlap, not over 95%, but the degree of overlap for District 30 is 85.47%. And for District 31, there's an overlap of 82.19%.
And did the whole county rule dictate how to divide up Durham County between these four districts?
It did not.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 133, which is Figure 10 of Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. Which county grouping is this?
This exhibit depicts the Lenoir and Pitt county grouping in the House plan.
And what did you find for this county grouping?
Well, we see here that Dr. Hoffler had in fact already finished drafting up all three of these districts in his June 28th draft plan. They are completely identical to the final House Bill 927 plan version of these same three districts in this county grouping.
Did the whole county rule dictate how to divide up Pitt County between these three districts?
No, it did not.
Did the whole county rule mandate that Dr. Hoffler create that sort of squiggle that we see going out from District 9 into District 8?
No, it did not.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 129, which is Figure 6 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. Which county grouping is this?
This exhibit depicts the Columbus, Pender, and Robeson county grouping in the House plan.
What do you find for this county grouping?
Well, we see that there's one district, District 16, that has an overlap of 93.63% with the final House Bill 927 version of this district. We see that there's another district, District 47, whose overlap is 84.97% with the final version of District 47.
And did the whole county rule dictate, looking at, for instance, Robeson County, how to split up Robeson County between districts 46 and 47?
No, it did not.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 131, which is Chen rebuttal, Figure 8. Which county grouping is this?
This exhibit depicts the Forsyth-Yadkin county grouping in the House plan.
What results did you find here?
Well, there are two districts that exhibit over 90% overlap between Dr. Hoffler's draft version in June 28th and the final House Bill 927 plan version of these districts. And those two districts were Districts 73 and 75. Both have an overlap of over 90%.
And did the whole county rule mandate how to split up these 5 districts within Forsyth County?
No, it did not.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 132. Just Chen rebuttal, Figure 9. Which county grouping is this?
This exhibit depicts the Granville, Person, Vance, and Warren county grouping in the House plan.
And what do you find?
I find that the two districts that Dr. Hoffler had drawn in the June 28th draft map are identical to the two districts in this county grouping in the final House Bill 927 plan that the General Assembly passed.
So Dr. Hoffler had totally completed drawing this county grouping by June 28th?
It appears to have been totally completed by then.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 125. This is the last one. Chen rebuttal report, Figure 2. Which county grouping is this?
This exhibit shows the Alexander, Allegheny, Rockingham, Stokes, Surrey, and Wilkes county grouping in the House.
And what do you find in this county grouping?
Well, we see that there's one district that has a near perfect degree of overlap. That's District 65. Almost everybody who was assigned to Dr. Hoffler's version of District 65 was also assigned to the final version of District 65 in the House Bill 927 plan. Additionally, we see that there's another district, District 91, where the overlap is 88%, and another district, District 97, where the overlap is 82.99%.
Dr. Chen, what overall conclusions do you draw from your analysis of Dr. Hoffler's June 28, 2017 draft House map with respect to whether the adopted criteria constrained him in drawing the enacted House plan and the extent to which he was following the adopted criteria in drawing the House plan?
Well, given that we've just looked at these county groupings where some or all of the districts had already been completed within the county groupings, it's pretty clear here that when he was drafting up these districts, Dr. Hoffler logically could not have followed the adopted criteria if he had largely completed the plan by June the 28th, since the adopted criteria were not passed until August the 10th.
Moving on, Dr. Chen, beyond your overlap analysis, did you use the Hoffler files to do any other analysis of whether the enacted plans comply with the adopted criteria?
Yes, I analyzed the extent to which Dr. Hoffler complied with the prohibition on consideration of racial data.
Objection. Your Honor.
Overruled.
Let's pull up Exhibit 588, which is the adopted criteria.
If you'll give me a moment.
Yes. And just looking at the bottom, what did the adopted criteria say with respect to the use of racial data?
That paragraph reads, data identifying the race of individuals or voters shall not be used in the drawing of legislative districts in the 2017 House and Senate plans.
And what was the title of that criterion?
The title is, quote, no consideration of racial data, end quote.
Dr. Chen, did you review any other statements by legislative defendants to help you interpret or understand this criterion?
I did.
If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 606. Dr. Chen, what is this?
This is a transcript of a August the 24th, 2017 Senate Redistricting Committee hearing.
And if we could go to page 102. And Dr. Chen, if I could just ask you to read the statement from Senator Hayes, starting at line 15, going through line 22, which is on the screen here.
Senator Hayes says, quote, Dr. Hoffler was given the criteria of this committee, which was significantly different from the criteria of the previous committee. As a result, the court rulings and from the criteria drew maps that did not include race. Race was not part of the database. It could not be calculated on the system that is done.
Dr. Chen, did you also review a legal brief from legislative defendants?
I did.
If I could direct your attention to page 39 of your rebuttal report. What other legal brief did you, within Exhibit 123, which is the rebuttal report. On page 39, what legal filing did you review and what specific portion of it did you review? What did it say?
I reviewed the filing on September the 22nd of 2017, and this is in the Covington versus North Carolina litigation. And in this court filing, legislative defendants stated, quote, data regarding the race of voters was not even loaded into the computer used by the map drawer to construct the districts.
Dr. Chen, based on those two statements we just read, what did you understand the criterion and the adopted criteria regarding racial data to mean?
Well, I understood the criteria to mean just what we heard in those quotes, that racial data was not even loaded into the computer, that racial data regarding the districts was not to be loaded into the system.
Into the system used by who?
By the map drawer.
And how did you go about analyzing whether Dr. Hoffler complied with that criterion?
I reviewed a number of Dr. Hoffler's Maptitude backup files.
If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 570.
Sorry.
Objection, Your Honor, this is not a screen from Dr. Hoffman's computer.
I couldn't hear you, Mr.
I'm
Foster.
sorry, Your Honor. We object to this exhibit because it's not a screen from Dr. Hoffman's computer. Someone else made the screen.
We'll allow the authentication of it by the witness.
We could put it on the screen.
Yeah, I think that may be one we don't.
I apologize. This is one of those two that I mentioned.
Go ahead.
Dr. Chen, can you explain to us and to the court how this screenshot was taken?
Well, this is a screenshot of a Maptitude backup, And so what happened is that the Maptitude backup was opened up, and the screenshot was taken by Mr. Esselstyn.
Let me stop you right there, Dr. Chen. Who is Mr. Esselstyn?
Blake Esselstyn is plaintiff's, my understanding is that Mr. Esselstyn is plaintiff's consulting expert, and he's an expert on Maptitude.
And did you disclose in your expert report that you relied on Mr. Esselstyn to help you open up the Maptitude files? Is that correct?
Yes, I described that at the bottom of page 2 of my response report from June.
Your Honor, I'd like to object again, because obviously Mr. Esselstyn is no longer a consulting expert. We had no chance to post him, and this should have been disclosed, and we should be when the expert reports were due, and we should have had a chance to post this person.
If I could respond, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
As we just noted, Mr. Esselstyn's role as a consulting expert was disclosed on the face of the rebuttal report, and in fact, Mr. Farr asked Dr. Chen at his deposition questions about all of this, about Mr. Esselstyn's role and how it was that they created these exhibits. So all of this was disclosed, and they did have an opportunity to cross-examine the witness about this.
I never had a chance to cross-examine Mr. Esselstyn.
I believe under Rule 703, this is the basis of an opinion of an expert that we're going to allow for the purposes of this testimony. So the objection's over.
And just to close the loop, Dr. Chen, is this a screenshot that Mr. Esselstyn took while you were observing him open the Maptitude file that was obtained from Dr. Hoffler's daughter?
Yes, sir.
And what was the name of this file that you analyzed?
The Maptitude plan name is, quote, NC House J-25.
And when was this file last modified?
The last modified date is August the 14th, 2017 at 7:07 a.m. in the morning.
If we could, I'm going to hand up to the court plaintiff's demonstrative, D1.
And I'll just note, we do have Exhibit 570 in our notebooks. So, yes.
May I approach you?
Yes, please.
Dr. Chen, what is this demonstrative? If we could pull that up, D1.
This is an October 15th, 2017 transcript of a hearing in the Covington case.
And if we could turn to page 78 of this transcript. Dr. Chen, can I ask you to read the question that was posed by Judge Nguyen on lines 15 to 17?
On lines 15 to 17, Judge Nguyen asked, I do have a question, and that is, in drawing the present maps, to what extent did the map drawers look at the maps that we found to be unconstitutional?
And if I could ask you to read, Dr. Chen, the response from Legislative Defendants Council on lines 18 to 22.
Legislative Defendants Council responded, quote, they did not look at them. They weren't on the map drawer's computer. Obviously, everybody knows everybody knows what those districts look like in general, but they were not expressly used to actually draw the maps. I mean, basically, the map drawer started with a clean slate.
If we could go back and now again to Plaintiff's Exhibit 570, the same property screenshot we were looking at. Dr. Chen, you explained earlier how the comments field here gives the lineage of each draft map. In your opinion, what was the starting point for this draft map?
Well, I'm just reading those rows in the comments box. And as I said, they go in chronological order. So earlier I described the lineage in reverse chronological order from most recent to further back. So let's look at the starting point. Ultimately, this plan, the one that we've got open here in Maptitude, it was derived from a previous plan, and that was derived from another plan, and that was derived from another plan. And where's the starting point of that lineage that's listed on the first row? It says, quote, copied from final NC House adopted. And presumably, final NC House adopted refers to the 2011 adopted House plan.
So if it is in fact the case, Dr. Chen, that that top row refers to the final adopted 2011 House plan, is it in fact the case that Dr. Hoffler started from a, quote, clean slate that was totally divorced from the prior 2011 plan that was struck down as a racial gerrymander?
That would not appear to be the case.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 148, which is Chen Rebuttal Figure 25. Dr. Chen, before we get into the details of this copious amounts of data, is this a window from the same Maptitude file that we were just looking at the properties page for?
It is. It's called the Data View 1 window.
And based on how Maptitude backups work, is this Data View 1 window, is this how that window would have appeared on Dr. Hoffler's computer when he last closed this draft plan?
Yes, it is.
Dr. Chen, we'll zoom in on the relevant portions of the table in a moment, but what does this window show with respect to Dr. Hoffler's use of racial data?
Well, it shows several columns. Now, all the rows in this window are describing one of the districts in Dr. Hoffler's draft map. So that's what every row is. And then the columns are describing various attributes or various characteristics of these districts. And we can see a number of columns here that actually describe racial data.
And if we could move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 149, which is just a zoom in of the same exhibit we were just looking at. This is Figure 26 of Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. I think I just answered this question for you, Dr. Chen, but what is this exhibit?
So this is a zoomed-in version of what we just saw. It's a zoomed-in version on the first roughly 10 columns of that data view window that we just saw the entirety of that data view window in the previous exhibit.
And if we look at the fifth column that says percentage 18 plus underscore AP underscore BLK. If I got it.
And I just want to correct you. I believe you're reading the seventh column there.
I apologize. whatever is the correct number column that has that title, what does that mean?
Well, 18 plus underscore AP underscore BLK. It's pretty clear that that's referring to the any part black proportion of the district's voting age population. So that 18 plus refers to voting age population at 18 years or older. And the AP underscore BLK, that stands for any part black or any part African American.
And if you look at that column in conjunction with the very first column that says district, what do you find?
Well, that first column, it lists all the districts. And you can see the districts are actually out of numerical order. And the reason the districts are not in numerical order is because the districts, these rows in this data view window, they're not sorted by district number. Instead, they're sorted by the any part black proportion of the voting age population. In other words, these districts are sorted from most heavily African American to least heavily African American.
And Dr. Chen, is having racial data like this in your data view 1 window, is that something that has to be that way in Maptitude, or is that a choice that the map maker, in this case Dr. Hoffler, makes?
That's not something that automatically...
There's no foundation that Dr. Hoffman made the screen.
I could reframe the question.
Yes, sir.
Is having racial data of the nature that we're seeing here, is that something that necessarily happens in Maptitude, or is that a choice that the Maptitude user makes?
That's not something that automatically happens in Maptitude. One has to select the fields that the data view 1 window is showing.
And what about sorting districts in this manner from highest to lowest BVAP, highest to lowest African American population? Is that something that Maptitude does automatically, or is that something that the user does manually?
That's not something Maptitude does automatically. The user has to go in and do that.
We could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 150, which is figure 27 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. Dr. Chen, is this an image from the same Maptitude plan that we were just looking at the data for and for which we saw the properties window from?
Yes, sir, it is.
Objection, Your Honor, same grounds.
And if we look at the map portion of this, so excluding the box at the top left, but the map portion that has colors and numbers, based on how Maptitude backups work, is this how the districts and the colors and the gray boxes with numbers in them, the labels, is that how they would have appeared on the user's computer when this file was last closed?
Yes, it is.
If we look now at the box in the top left that says formula, what does that reveal?
That's called a formula window. And so we've zoomed in on that formula window here. And this allows the user to go in and create labels for the districts that we see in this map window that we were just looking at more broadly. So it's a formula window, and it allows you to create labels and allows you to specify what information to put in the labels that the user wants to put on the draft districts that we're seeing in the .map window. So let's break this down and see what this window actually says. And again, in this window, this formula window, that's something that the user has to type in, has to enter in there in order to design or construct the labels for the districts. So let's look at what that window actually says. It says district plus, and there's a line, and then it says format, and then it says %18+ underscore AP underscore BLK. So let's break down what that means. There are going to be two pieces of information that are being put into the labels here. This is going to create a label for all the 120.
Dr. Chen, if I could stop you right there. When you say the labels, are you referring to these gray squares or rectangles that we see over the districts in the map?
Exactly. We don't see them here, but if we zoom out there, we can see these gray labels. And those are the labels that are being created by this formula window.
And so what data is presented in those gray labels?
So let's zoom back in again on that formula window, and then we can see what data is going to be put into those labels. So there are two pieces of information here that are going to go into the label. The first piece of information is the district number. That's what that district, that word district there tells us. So the first piece of information is just going to be the district number. Now the second piece of information is going to appear on the second line of the label. So each district is going to have a label with 2 rows, 2 lines. And the first line is just going to tell us the district number. The second line is going to tell us the any part African American share of the voting age population. That's what that 18 plus AP underscore BLK is. So that's what the label is. And if we zoom back out to the layer, to the map layer, we will actually see those labels being properly displayed. And if we can just zoom in on one of those labels there, you can see that those 2 pieces of information are there. You see the district number, District 58, that's on the first row. Now look at the second row, 46.22%. District label is telling us that this is a district with 46.22% African American share of the voting age population. So that's how labels are created in Maptitude, and that's what that formula window is doing for us.
Dr. Chen, is creating labels for the maps that list the BVAP of each district, is that something that Maptitude does automatically, or is that something the user does manually?
That is something the user does manually.
So whoever created the last modified or created this file chose to display the BVAP of each district on the screen?
Exactly. And I just correct you, displayed it on the map.
The map,
window.
I'm sorry. If we could move to Plaintiff's Exhibit 151. Figure 28 from Dr. Chen's report. Is this an image from the same Maptitude file we were just looking at?
It is, except this time the map window has been zoomed out to show the entire state of North Carolina, all 120 districts in this draft House plan.
And just briefly, what do the gray labels show? What data is in the gray labels?
So same labels. It was created by that formula field that we were just looking at a moment ago. So every one of these labels that we see here on this screenshot, it's going to contain 2 pieces of information. The top row tells us the district number, and the bottom row tells us the African American share of the voting age population of that district, because that's how the district label was constructed.
Dr. Chen, can you remind us, what was the date of the adopted criteria's passage that bans consideration or possession of racial data?
August the 10th, 2017.
And when was this Maptitude file last modified?
August the 14th of 2017.
So 4 days later.
Exactly.
Based on this analysis, what do you conclude with respect to Dr. Hoffler's compliance with the adopted criterion's prohibition on use or consideration of racial data?
Well, based on my analysis and the findings here that we've looked at, it appears that Dr. Hoffler was not complying with the adopted criteria's prohibition on, quote, consideration of racial data.
That was the draft Senate map you analyzed. Did you also analyze any draft? I'm sorry, that was a draft House map that you analyzed from August 14th. Did you also analyze any draft Senate maps from around that same time period?
Yes, sir, I did.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 571. I'll do this one faster than the last one.
If you could just give me a moment.
Yes. And what was the name of this draft Senate plan?
The name of this draft Senate plan was, quote, NC Senate J-23.
And when was this plan last modified?
August the 13th, 2017.
And again, if we go through the, I'm sorry, bear with me one moment, Dr. Chen. And what was the, if you could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 152. I'm sorry, can we just go back to that one for a second? $571. What's listed in the administrator field here for this draft Senate plan?
The administrator field, the user appears to have typed in TBH, presumably meaning Dr. Thomas Hoffler.
If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 152, which is figure 29 from Dr. Chen's report.
If you could give me a moment.
Sure. What is this figure showing?
This is a screenshot of the Data View 1 window for that draft Senate plan on August 13th. That has a last modified date of August 13th, 2017. And it came from a Maptitude backup that's called NC Senate J-23005.bak.zip.
And again, based on how Maptitude backups work, is this how the data view 1 window would have appeared in the user's file when the user last closed out of the file?
Yes, sir, it is.
What does this Senate plan, or I'm sorry, what does this figure show with respect to Dr. Hoffler's possession of racial data in this draft Senate plan?
Well, we can see the same racial data columns. And the one that's highlighted here, it's about 10 columns from the right. If we could just zoom in right there, we can see the name of that column. It's that same column name again, %18+ underscore AP underscore BLK, indicating the African American share of the voting age population.
And again, using the district column in the first column paired with that column, what do we see?
So the district column is just telling us the Senate district here in this particular draft Maptitude plan. And so, of course, there are 50 draft districts, or 50 districts in this draft Senate plan. And again, we can see here that the districts are not ordered by district number. The district numbers are out of order. And that's because when we look at the racial column, the any part African American column, we can see that the districts were actually sorted from most heavily to least heavily African American population.
And again, is that something that Maptitude does automatically or something the user would have to do manually?
It's something that the user would have to do.
And can you remind us, what was the last modified date of this file?
August the 13th, 2017.
And when was the adopted criteria prohibiting use of racial data passed?
August the 10th.
Dr. Chen, did you analyze any other Maptitude files from July and August 2017 to see if they possess racial data? And I'll point you to page 47 of your rebuttal report.
I did. There was an Excel spreadsheet titled Senate County Groups that I analyzed.
I'm sorry, Dr. Chen. Asking about, did you analyze any other Maptitude files?
I'm
Not
sorry, I
Excel
misheard
files.
you. So I did analyze other Maptitude files as well. And on page 47 of my June report, I've listed 4 additional Maptitude backups for draft plans in Maptitude that I also analyzed similarly and found similar racial data.
So you found similar racial data in all of those Maptitude?
Yes, I did.
Or some racial data, I should say.
Yes.
Dr. Chen, did you analyze any Maptitude files containing drafts of the 2017 plans that did not have racial data in them?
No, I didn't.
So every single one of the Maptitude files that you analyzed from Dr. Hoffler's hard drive did have racial data in it?
Yes.
Dr. Chen, did you find that Dr. Hoffler had racial data in his draft districts in any other types of files other than Maptitude files? And here again, I'll point you to page 47 of your rebuttal report.
I did. I looked at an Excel spreadsheet titled Senate County Groups, and it had a last modified date of August the 3rd, 2017.
And what did you find in that file, that Excel file?
Well, this was a file in which Dr. Hoffler had listed all the county groupings for the Senate plan. And for each one of these county groupings, Dr. Hoffler appeared to have calculated the any part African American voting age population of that grouping.
If we could pull up again plaintiff's demonstrative D1, the hearing transcript. Dr. Chen, can you remind us what this transcript is?
This was a hearing in the Covington case, a transcript of a Covington case.
From October 2017, does that sound right?
I can't remember the precise date right now.
Will you accept my representation that was from October of 2017?
Yes, sir.
If we could go to page 83 to 84, bottom of page 83, and then go to the top of page 84. Could I ask you to read the statement that Legislative Defendants Council made on lines 2 through 4 of page 84? The line 2 on the bottom.
Legislative Defense Counsel stated, quote, "There is no evidence, none whatsoever, that Dr. Hoffler used race predominantly, that he looked at any data, that any knowledge he had was used to specifically identify high BVAP precincts and put them all together."
Dr. Chen, based on the files we just reviewed, is it in fact the case that Dr. Hoffler, quote, looked at racial data, and specifically data on districts with high BVAPs?
Yes.
What overall conclusions do you draw from your analysis of the Maptitude and Excel files containing racial data?
Well, I concluded that Dr. Hoffler did not appear to comply with the adopted criteria's prohibition on, quote, consideration of racial data. That in fact, there was racial data loaded into Dr. Hoffler's computer, into his hard drive, into his Maptitude backup files, and that he was analyzing, he was looking at the racial composition of the draft districts that he was drawing.
Dr. Chen, did you use the Hoffler files to do any analysis of Dr. Hoffler's use of partisan considerations?
Yes, I did.
We're going to take a 15-minute break.
Yes, sir.
So we'll resume at 4:15.
Superior Court stands adjourned until 4:15.
Mr. Jacobson, further questions?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Dr. Chen, did you use the Hoffler files to do any analysis of Dr. Hoffler's use of partisan considerations?
Yes, I did.
What folders of Dr. Hoffler did you analyze for purposes of this analysis? And to help you out, I'll point you to page 76 of your rebuttal report.
There are two folders from Dr. Hoffler's backup devices, and those two folders were titled, quote, NC 2017 redistricting, end quote, and another folder entitled, quote, 2017 redistricting, end quote.
And without taking up more time than we need to, did the folder path for each of those folders, did it use the name Tom before Tom/NC 2017 redistricting?
Yes, it did.
Did you review the entire contents of these two folders?
I looked at all of the files in those two folders.
And are all the files we're about to look at over this next segment, are all of those files from one of those two folders?
Yes, they are.
Reviewing the contents of those two folders, what did you find with respect to Dr. Hoffler's use of partisanship formulas for his draft districts?
Well, I found that there were 3 partisan formulas that Dr. Hoffler used.
And if we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 153, which is figure 30 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. What does this figure show?
This is the first of these 3 formulas that I mentioned. And this is a Microsoft Word document from the 2017 redistricting folder that I just mentioned. And the Microsoft Word document is entitled Formula for Political Analysis of Legislative Districts.docx. It's a Microsoft Word document, and it lays out a very specific partisan formula that Dr. Hoffler uses throughout some Microsoft Excel spreadsheets to analyze the partisanship of districts that he was drafting up. So it's a partisan formula, and it's based on 2008 to 2014 statewide elections. So there's a list right there in this document where he has listed out 9 statewide elections. And these elections are aggregated up for any given district, any one of Dr. Hoffler's draft districts. He aggregates these election results up and calculates essentially the Republican share of the 2-party vote across these 9 elections.
And Dr. Chen, is everything above where it says note at the bottom of this exhibit, everything above that, is that just a screenshot of this Microsoft Word file from Dr. Hoffler's hard drives?
Yes, I took a screenshot of that Microsoft Word document.
And these 9 elections that Dr. Hoffler wrote would be used as part of this partisanship formula. How does that compare to the 10 elections, the 10 statewide elections that Representative Lewis claimed would be used for purposes of the 2017 redistricting?
This is a different set of elections. Representative Lewis laid out a set of 10 elections from 2010 to 2016. This is a different set of elections. You can see that 4 of them are actually from 2008, but these elections come from 2008 to 2014.
And through what time period did you find that Dr. Hoffler was employing this particular partisanship formula? Through at least what time period?
Going through July of 2017.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 165, which is figure 45 of Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. What's the second partisanship formula that you found Dr. Hoffler used? I might have written the wrong number. So I think this might be Plaintiff's Exhibit 164. I apologize. Okay, what's the second partisanship formula that you found Dr. Hoffler used?
Okay, so it's called a PPI indicator in this file, and it's a PPI indicator. So this file here calls it PPI indicator votes for new 2017 legislative districts. That's the title of this file. And it's another aggregated statewide election composite, except this time in this PPI indicator, Dr. Hoffler is using the same 10 elections that Representative Lewis said that the redistricting committee was going to use in August of 2017. And so those are the 10 elections that we've laid out that are listed in this spreadsheet here. And it says key statewide office indicator votes for 2010 to 2016, and in parentheses, PPI. Basically, Dr. Hoffler was calculating the Republican vote share of these 10 statewide elections.
And you found this file in those folders that we mentioned, is that correct?
Exactly. It was the other folder called NC 2017 redistricting. That's where this Excel sheet came
But
from.
Dr. Chen, to your recollection, the best of your recollection, did you find any instances where Dr. Hoffler was actually applying this formula of these 10 elections to the files that you found within those two folders, to the best of your recollection?
Not in the Excel sheets that I analyzed.
In all of those, he was using the other formula, using the 9 elections we just looked at?
He was using that 9 election formula, that so-called average R election formula.
And what's the final formula you found that Dr. Hoffler used?
So the final one is called an off-year election formula.
And what elections did that include?
It generally included the 2010 to 2014 U.S. Senate elections. And so it was called an off-year election formula because, as we'll soon see, there are columns in various Excel spreadsheets of Dr. Hoffler's where he is calculating for draft districts the, quote, off year. And so what basically the off-year election formula was based on these 2 off-year elections, the 2010 and 2014 U.S. Senate elections. These sort of non-presidential year elections are sometimes colloquially referred to as, quote, off-year elections. And so it was really apparent what Dr. Hoffler was trying to do. He wanted to measure the partisanship of his districts to try and evaluate how they might perform or what their partisanship might be in non-presidential years, these so-called off years like 2010 and 2014, where there's not a presidential race.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 248, which is a file titled Senate Minimum Partisan Members.xlsx.
If you could give me a moment.
Sure. The same one is, it just got cut off the file. Same screenshot of the same ones in this report. From the report, 43. Dr. Chen, what kind of file is this?
This is a Microsoft Excel file.
And when was this file last modified?
November the 26th, 2016.
And how do you know that was the last modified date?
I looked at the metadata of the file properties, and it showed the last modified date of November 26th.
What does the first column indicate, the one that's titled group type?
Here, Dr. Hoffler is describing in this column the county grouping type. And so sometimes a county grouping is described as new, sometimes it's described as old. And then it appears for some of the Democratic-leaning county groupings, like Mecklenburg, Cumberland, and Wake Franklin, he's just actually listed out the county grouping and shaded it in yellow. So we see sometimes that he's listed out the county grouping.
But all those yellow ones were also new county groupings, is that right?
Yes.
What's the third column that says AVGR? What does that represent?
That's average R. That was that first of the 3 measures of partisanship that we just talked about a moment ago. And so I looked at this column and looked at the numbers and looked at where they came from. And I saw that Dr. Hoffler here was measuring the partisanship of his draft districts using that first average R, AVGR measure of partisanship. That measure that was based on the 2008 to 2014 statewide elections that we saw in that Microsoft Word document a few moments back. So this was a measure of the partisanship, the Republican vote share of the draft districts that he was evaluating here in this plan.
And what about the next 2 columns over?
These are columns describing the incumbents in these districts. So he's listed the incumbent that would reside within each of these draft districts in the next column. And the final column past that one that says PTY, he's obviously talking about the party, the partisan affiliation of these incumbents.
If we scroll down to the very bottom of this exhibit, on the second page there, we'll see it says 23 under 53%. What does that represent?
That line was Dr. Hoffler making a note to himself that this draft Senate plan has 23 districts that are under a 53% Republican vote share. And he was using the average R measure that we saw earlier.
In your opinion, based on your redistricting experience, why would Dr. Hoffler care how many districts were above 53% vote share as opposed to, say, 50% Republican vote share?
Well, if one had partisan considerations in drafting up the map, it is notable that districts under 53% are obviously districts that are not safe Republican districts. They could include close districts, maybe Democratic districts, but they're not safe Republican districts. And so that's what that note is talking about.
So in your opinion, was Dr. Hoffler counting how many districts provided a safer or more cushion across the total plan?
Basically.
How's he supposed to know what Dr. Hoffler's talking about here?
We're going to overrule the objection, allow the testimony to get such weight as appropriate. We're allowing his opinion on what he has gleaned from this evidence, and we understand that ultimately
Thank you, Your Honor.
state of mind is something that the finders of fact need to determine.
Well, in general, the reason that a map drawer who's thinking about partisanship might want to focus on that is the map drawer might want to know how many really safe Republican districts there are and how many not safe Republican districts there are, or how many not safe districts there are in the draft plan that the map drawer is building up here.
And so if using your term safe or safer, how many total districts out of 50 Senate districts did Dr. Hoffler, in your opinion, how many fall into that category of being safe Republican districts here?
Well, there were 23 that were under 53%. So that means that there were 27 that were over 53%. In other words, 27 safer Republican districts.
If you could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 244, which is a file titled NC Senate Minimum Partisan J2. Patrick, this is 39 from the rebuttal report. Again, what type of file was this?
This is a Microsoft Excel file.
When was this file last modified?
June the 13th, 2017.
And what does the third column that says average R represent?
This is a Senate plan, so there are 50 Senate districts. And the third column tells us once again that, quote, average R measure of partisanship. The Republican vote share, as Dr. Hoffler calculated it, based on his 2008 to 2014 statewide elections.
And how about the next column over that says 14 Sen percentage?
That's basically a version of that so-called off-year election measure, partisan measure that I talked about some time ago. That was the third of the three measures. So here, Dr. Hoffler was using the results of the 2014 U.S. Senate election to measure the Republican vote share of these draft districts, and that's what he reported in this column.
How about the final two columns in this chart? The ones titled Old Av R and then the final one, 11 TI 17. What do those represent?
Let's start with the Old Av R column. That column has Dr. Hoffler calculating the Republican vote share using that average R measure, but this column calculates the average R measure, the Republican vote share, of the old districts, the 2011 planned districts. So that's what he calls the old average R. So that's what that next to last column says. Now let's look at the final column. So just to recap, in the third column, we have the average R of these new draft districts. And then in the next to last column, we have the Republican vote share of the old existing the old existing enacted plan districts. Now what Dr. Hoffler does in this final column is look at the difference between the old Republican vote share and this new draft plan district Republican vote share. He's taking the difference between the old average R and the average R, the current draft plan. So that's what 11 TI 17 gives us. He's looking at the difference in partisanship between the old districts and this current draft districts.
And Dr. Chen, if we go back now to column 3, the third column, the one that says AVGR, you'll see that the cells have different colors. And looking at District 7, for instance, some of the cells are colored yellow. What does yellow coloring indicate in this column?
When you look up and down this column, you'll see that Dr. Hoffler has shaded in yellow districts that are between 50 to 53% Republican vote share using his average R measure of partisanship.
And how about the 4 rows directly below that? 8 through 11, they look like a peach or orange shaded color. What does that color indicate for this column?
Anywhere in this file where Dr. Hoffler has shaded this column using that peach color, he's indicating districts that have a 53 to 55% Republican vote share.
And what do the fact that there's that differentiation between those colors, what does that represent to you in your expert opinion?
Well, it shows that the map drawer was focused on different gradations or different levels of Republican vote share in the Republican-leaning districts. The map drawer here was clearly trying to track the number of 50 to 53. In other words, just maybe sort of barely Republican districts and then relatively safer districts from 53 to 55. He was just closely tracking these Republican districts to see how safe they were or to keep track of how safe they were.
And if we look back at the first column, zoom out again, you noted this before, but some of the most heavily Democratic districts in the state, or groupings in the state, like Mecklenburg, Cumberland, Wake Franklin, are shaded yellow. Was Dr. Hoffler tracking the partisanship that he created in these heavily Democratic overall county groupings?
Yes, he was.
And what does that indicate to you? What fact does that indicate to you?
Well, it suggests to us that even in these Democratic-leaning county groupings, counties and county groupings, like Mecklenburg and Wake Franklin, Dr. Hoffler was still trying to see if he could squeeze out a couple of Republican districts. He was still tracking the partisanship of those districts with his shading method and the average R measure of partisanship. And he was still doing this even in the Democratic districts. I'm sorry, in the Democratic counties and county groupings.
If we could scroll down to the very bottom of this chart on page 2, maybe not the very, very bottom, but the text there. It says, quote, pressure points for GOP incumbents. What information is presented there?
This is a section that appears in some of Dr. Hoffler's Excel files in these folders. And in this section here, we can see that Dr. Hoffler is making note of some particular notes of interest regarding Republican incumbents and the points at which they might be somehow electorally vulnerable or special considerations for their electoral vulnerability. So, for example, you see notes about how particular Republican incumbents are, quote, double bunked or paired into a district with another incumbent. There's notes about whether a particular incumbent is in a, quote, strong GOP district, things along those lines, affecting the possible electoral vulnerability of those Republican incumbents in this particular draft map that he's considering.
Dr. Chen, in this file or any of the other files that you analyzed, did you find anything where Dr. Hoffler was analyzing, quote, pressure points for Democratic incumbents?
No, he doesn't do a parallel analysis of, quote, pressure points for Democratic incumbents.
Only GOP incumbents.
Correct.
If we look at the tables at the very, very bottom of this exhibit, what do we see?
These tables show Dr. Hoffler counting up the number of districts in this particular draft Senate map that achieve particular bins or particular thresholds of Republican vote share. And so you see two tables here. The one on the left is using his, quote, average R measure of partisanship. And the one on the right is using his 2014 US Senate election measure of partisanship. But these two tables are fundamentally doing the same thing. For each table, he is counting up the number of districts that fall into each window or each bin of partisanship. So, for example, you see that first row, he's counting up the number of districts that are 65 to 100% Republican. There are 4 such districts. Later on down, he counts up the number of districts that are between 50 to 53% Republican vote share, 53 to 55, and so on. So he's counting up the number of districts that are within each particular bin of Republican partisanship.
And Dr. Chen, I mentioned this before, but I just want to reinforce it. The average R column that we see in this Excel sheet and all the other Excel sheets, that's the partisanship formula that includes the 2008 election results, is that right?
That's correct. It uses the 2008 to 2014 statewide elections that Dr. Hoffler listed in that first Microsoft Word document that we looked at a while back.
Dr. Chen, the two Excel files we just looked at were for draft Senate plans. Did you look at any similar Excel files for draft House plans that Dr. Hoffler had?
Yes, I did.
If we pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 241, Patrick, this is 33 from the bottom. When was this file last modified?
December the 6th, 2016.
And again, the AVGR column, is that the same 2008 to 2014 formula?
The same measure.
And as before, what does yellow highlighting in this column mean? For instance, the second row there, District 2.
You look up and down that column and you can see that Dr. Hoffler has done the same thing. He's highlighting in yellow any districts that are between 50 to 53% Republican vote share using this average R measure.
And the same thing, if we look at District 9, the peach orange shading, that's for districts that are 53 to 56% vote share?
Those are districts that are from 53 to 55%
Okay.
Republican vote share.
If we scroll, and I'm sorry, the next column over for off year, is that the off year election formula that you described earlier?
Yes, it is.
If we scroll down to the very bottom of this exhibit, the table at the very bottom, what does that table show?
This table is another similar counting up of the number of draft House districts in this draft plan that Dr. Hoffler is analyzing here that achieve particular bins or particular thresholds of partisanship. So we see one row here counting up the number of districts that are 0 to 45 and then 45 to 50% Republican vote share, 50 to 53 and then 53 to 55 and so on.
So Dr. Chen, if I could stop you right there, the same thing on the last chart. Do you notice any asymmetries in this chart in terms of the level of gradations for which Dr. Hoffler is creating these bins between Republican favorable districts over 50% and Democratic favorable districts under 50%?
Well, Dr. Hoffler appears to be exhibiting a much higher degree of granularity in analyzing the Republican district side of the map, and much less so on the Democratic district side. You see this in the fact that there are so many of these rows that are 50 to 53, 53 to 55, and so on. And so you can see there are 5 total rows analyzing the different types of districts on the Republican side, but only 2 for districts below 50% Republican vote share. So there's just this much higher degree of granularity. He's really fine-grained trying to analyze the precise Republican vote share of the Republican districts, but he's not exhibiting a symmetric concern for the Democratic districts.
If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 246. Corresponds to figure 41 from Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. Looking at Exhibit 246, when was this file last modified?
June the 14th, 2017.
And without going through all the details, does this table contain the same columns of categories of information as the prior ones?
Yes, it does.
But if we scroll to the bottom of this exhibit, this is again the House now, do you find an analysis here similar to what we saw on the Senate side?
Yes. At the very bottom here, he's listing out, Dr. Hoffler has listed out, quote, pressure points for GOP incumbents, in which once again, he's making special note of incumbents that, with respect to points where they might be electorally vulnerable. He's talking about different incumbents being combined into a district, the extent to which they are, quote, leaning Republican districts, and so on. So these are special so-called pressure points for Republican incumbents.
And what's an example of that if we look at the final row, number 7?
Well, he's written in this final row here in this Excel spreadsheet that a Republican, Bradford, and Democrat, Beasley, are, quote, combined in a strong Republican district in Mecklenburg.
So Dr. Hoffler characterized that House district in Mecklenburg as a, quote, strong Republican district?
Yes, he did.
Now, Dr. Chen, I'll ask you the same question I asked you before on the Senate side. Did you find any files anywhere in which Dr. Hoffler performed a similar analysis of, quote, pressure points for Democratic incumbents?
I did not find a parallel analysis of pressure points for Democratic incumbents.
And again, if we zoom out now, and I'll do this more briefly, again, some of the largest Democratic counties and county groupings such as Wake and Cumberland and so on are shaded yellow here. Was Dr. Hoffler tracking the partisanship within those county groupings?
Yes, he was.
And what do you conclude from that fact?
Well, it shows us, again, that even within the Democratic county groupings, like Mecklenburg and Wake, Dr. Hoffler was still trying to track whether or not he could squeeze out some Republican districts in these county groupings.
Did you analyze any other files of Dr. Hoffler for evidence of him using partisan considerations in deciding between different alternative ways to draw districts within a county grouping?
Yes, I did.
We could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 166, which is figure 46 from Dr. Chen's report.
If you could just give me a moment.
And what was the name of this, the title of this file?
This was an Excel file titled Johnston Senate Switch.xlsx.
And when was it last modified?
December the 11th, 2016.
What does this file show?
Well, it's Dr. Hoffler's analysis of districts within the Johnston County, within Johnston County here. And he's talking about Senate districts here. And he's comparing 3 different plans here. So that's why we see 3 different sections here from left to right. The first section is just looking at the 3 districts in Johnston from the 2011 enacted plan. And then in the middle, he's comparing those to the, quote, new plan that he's evaluating, a new draft plan. And then to the right, he's evaluating yet another draft plan called, quote, new plan switch. Now, what is he focusing on in these numbers here for Districts 10, 11, and 12? These are partisan numbers. These are Republican vote share numbers. He's looking at the Republican vote share of the 3 districts in this grouping, or in Johnston County here, for these 3 different versions of Johnston County districts.
Dr. Chen, did you find evidence that Dr. Hoffler analyzed the partisan attributes of draft maps that were drawn by somebody other than him, say law students?
Yes, Dr. Hoffler analyzed the partisanship of of House and Senate maps produced by Campbell law students.
We could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 757, which is an email that was admitted yesterday, I believe. And that might not be in your binders, I apologize. Yeah. We could focus on the bottom email there, zoom in on that. Dr. Chen, I'll represent to you that it was said yesterday in court, and I think this will be non-controversial, that there was testimony yesterday that this represents an email from somebody who worked for Senate leadership with a subject line titled Common Cause Maps, in which this individual asked for the block assignment files of the Common Cause maps. Does
Yes,
that
sir.
look like an accurate representation based on this email?
Yes, sir.
What was the date of this email?
June the 29th of 2017.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 167, which is figure 47 of Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. What's the title of this file?
This file is titled, quote, NC Senate CCNC Sample Plan June 2017.xlsx.
When was this file last modified?
July the 8th, 2017.
So about a week after that email we just saw seeking block assignment files, if my math is right.
Exactly.
What do the numbers in column G, what does CCNC in the title of this file, what does that stand for?
Well, it appears to mean Common Cause North Carolina.
What does the numbers in column G represent?
Column G is labeled as percent Republican, and it's Dr. Hoffler calculating the Republican vote share of these draft districts in the so-called Senate CCNC, or the Senate Common Cause plan.
If we could pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 170, which is figure 49 from Dr. Chen's report. What was the name of this file?
This file is titled NC House CCNC sample plan dash June 2017 XLSX.
And again, what does CCNC stand for?
Common Cause, North Carolina.
And when was this file last modified?
July the 5th, 2017.
And does this column G of this file contain the same calculation of partisanship of the Campbell Law Students draft house map that we saw in the last file?
Yes, Dr. Hoffler calculated the Republican vote share of the districts in the Campbell Law Students map.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 168, which is figure 48A of Dr. Chen's rebuttal report. When was this file last modified?
July the 8th, 2017.
Could you, what were the headings for this file if you look at rows 1 through 4 of the Excel file itself?
The rows 1 through 4 read, State of North Carolina, State Senate, CCNC, Nonpartisan Redistricting Simulation, Partisan Breakdown.
And so, did Dr. Hoffler conduct a partisanship analysis of this, quote, nonpartisan redistricting simulation?
It appears that he was conducting a, quote, partisan breakdown of the districts in this nonpartisan redistricting simulation.
If we look at column I, the column titled percent rep period, what do the numbers in that column represent?
It's Dr. Hoffler's measure of the partisanship of these districts in the CCNC simulation plan, or the Senate plan drawn by the Campbell Law Students.
And if we look one column over to the left of that, the column titled Better POS, what does that represent?
Here, Dr. Hoffler is indicating in this column a yes, no, or a little, and specifically what he's looking at. I looked through these various rows here, and it's apparent that what Dr. Hoffler is indicating with these yes and a no is whether a, quote, better possibility, the name of the column, is possible for this particular grouping. And what is meant by better possibility is whether or not a better version of the county grouping could be drawn, of the districts there could be drawn, that would be better for the Republicans.
Better than the version that the Campbell Law Students drew. Is that right?
Exactly. In other words, whether or not the Campbell Law Students draft map had in fact produced the best possible version for the Republicans, or whether a better possible version was possible.
Dr. Chen, did you do any analysis of the districts in the enacted plan and whether any of those districts match the districts drawn by the Campbell Law Students?
Yes, I did.
And what did you find?
I found that there were 4 districts where the General Assembly's final enacted House plan, House Bill 927, matched those that were drawn by the Campbell Law Students. Those were HD 2 and 32 in the Granville, Person, Vance, and Warren County grouping, and HD 7 and HD 25 from the Franklin, Nash County grouping, both in the House.
And is there anything noticeable about those 4 districts and their partisan characteristics?
Yeah, and we've talked about some of this earlier today. These are both county groupings where there's a very discrete, limited number of unique possible ways that one could draw up the districts in the county grouping while still following the traditional districting criteria and the adopted criteria. And that's just because of relatively few VTDs and relatively small number of districts.
And what about in terms of the partisanship of those districts as drawn by the Campbell Law Students? Is it possible for Republicans to do better than the partisanship of the districts drawn by those Campbell Law Students for those 4 districts?
Well, those were districts for which there was not a so-called better possible version for the Republicans. And I looked at, my basis for saying that is not just the Excel file that we looked at where Dr. Hoffler had indicated better possibility, but also I looked at my own simulated plans, and I found that indeed these were the few areas in the House map, in the House plan, where the districts that the Campbell Law Students had drawn, it just so happened that in these particular 2 groupings, the versions drawn by the Campbell Law students were, in fact, the best possible version that could be drawn for the Republicans. Again, there were a very small number of unique possible ways one could carve up these two county groupings. And so the Campbell Law students happened to have drawn plans in these districts lines, in these groupings that were the so-called best possible version for the Republicans.
And Dr. Chen, based on your review of these files, is it your opinion that Dr. Hoffler picked off or cherry-picked 4 districts that the Campbell Law students drew that just happened to be the best possible way of drawing those districts for Republicans?
Yeah, based on my review, it appears that, number one, Dr. Hoffler, as we saw a moment ago, systematically analyzed the partisanship of all of the districts drawn by the Campbell Law students. He analyzed up and down the entire plan. But then he selectively kept and included in the enacted or in his draft maps just those districts, just those Campbell Law student districts, drawn districts, where he believed that it was not possible to create a so-called better possible version for the Republicans.
Objection. We would strike that in our, he doesn't know what Dr. Hoffler believed. He testified about the maps and the qualities, but you can't testify about what Dr. Hoffler believed.
Again, we're going to allow him to testify to the opinions that he gleaned from this evidence. We recognize that the ultimate decision about the state of mind of Dr. Hoffler may be an issue of fact, but it's for the triers of fact.
I'm sorry, I won't make a vote if
Yes,
it's
sir.
one of those ones.
You're welcome to make your objections and preserve the record, sir. Thank you.
Dr. Chen, I'm sorry. I'd like to transition now to talk about racial voting issues. As we've discussed before, did your algorithm consider racial data or racial issues at all in drawing the 4,000 total simulated plans that we talked about earlier today?
No, the simulation algorithm ignored racial data
And why was that?
because the adopted criteria specifically say no consideration of racial data.
Dr. Chen, in your work in this case, did you review a report prepared by legislative defendants expert Dr. Jeffrey Lewis from UCLA?
Objection, Your Honor. Dr. Lewis is no longer going to be a witness. His testimony, Dr. Chen's testimony on this was labeled as rebuttal testimony. There's nothing to rebut anymore because Dr. Lewis will not be testifying.
We're going to allow the testimony, and we can, if it turns out that it's purely rebuttal testimony, then we can certainly disregard it, but we're going to allow it and then make a determination. Without knowing what the testimony is, it's hard to rule on that motion.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. And I hope we'll establish that it's not disputing or rebutting what Dr. Lewis wrote. Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 721. Are these not in there? I'm sorry. Printing issues. What does this figure represent?
This is Dr. Lewis's Table 2, and it's a table in which Dr. Lewis has calculated the black CVAP necessary for an African-American preferred candidate to win in various elections in various counties and county groupings.
And so, just to take this one at a time, what do the numbers on the far right column represent?
That far right column under CVAP, that tells us, or that is Dr. Lewis reporting his estimated percent black of the CVAP, percent African-American share of the citizen voting age population that would be needed for the African-American preferred candidate to win these various contests in these various counties and county groupings.
And when you say these various contests, you mean, for instance, to win, this was Dr. Lewis's estimate of the minimum black percentage of the citizen voting age population for the African-American preferred candidate to win the election contest listed in the second and third columns. Do I have that right?
Exactly.
Pull up Plaintiff's Exhibit 722. And I'm sorry, can we go back to 721? The Table 2 from Dr. Lewis, those were all primary elections for which he was providing this estimate?
if we could just scroll to the bottom of this table here, and Dr. Lewis has explicitly said that these are selected Democratic primary election contests.
If we could now go to Exhibit 722, what does this table represent?
It's similar, but now it's an analysis of general election contests. But it's the same in that the far right column, that column on the far right, is where Dr. Lewis is reporting his estimated black share, African American share of the citizen voting age population in order for African American preferred candidates to win various elections in various counties that he's listed here in this table.
And this was Table 3 from Dr. Lewis's report.
Yes.
If we could pull up, and I'm going to hand up to your honors, if I may. These are exhibits that we emailed to the court last night. Just to give the context here, as I think we mentioned in our emergency motion to compel, Dr. Chen had done some analysis that was based on Dr. Lewis's numbers. But then in his deposition, Dr. Lewis said he realized he had made a mistake and revised some of those numbers, and your honors granted our motion to compel. We received the revised numbers yesterday, about 10 a.m. We received the revised numbers at about 10 a.m. yesterday.
It's 5 o'clock, and we're going to recess.
So this might be a good time to do that, and we'll resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock with starting right there. You'll recall tomorrow's the day we're going to recess about 3:30, so you just plan accordingly, but we'll start at 9 o'clock. All right. Anything? Be in recess until 9 tomorrow morning.
Superior Court stands in recess until tomorrow.